Hello and welcome from me and the dog who's just gone. Today I want to start looking at isometric movement, and we can say to start off with that what we're looking for is a balance between relaxation and tension and then bringing that into movement. And we can pretend that it's that easy to start off with because there's a lot of interesting things to say around that, but we want to get started straight away in thinking about this. So we know that isometric movement is used a lot in Chinese wushu, and there's different kinds of isometric movement. There's the very tense kind of southern boxing isometric movement, uses a kind of like a technique for strengthening muscles, and then there's the kind of Bruce Lee isometric where you're pushing against an object. And we're trying to find just a slightly different use of this concept, and that tells us straight away that isometric it's not just one thing, it's multiple different things, and it's going to be for us as well. So once we've got that idea that we want to find this balance between relaxation and tension, then we can think very simply about how we use that, bringing it into different planes and ways of movement. And this is very often systematized to help the student learn. You don't really want to leave people just like working out how to do it. You can do that, there's no problem with that, but it just helps a lot if you just systematize it a little bit and think about some basics like forwards and backwards, up and down, out and in. And we can say those are like the basics, and then we can go on to like a slightly more intermediate where we're using angled movements, going off angles, circular movements. And then there's just like a slightly more advanced where we start using screwing movements, using screwing force movements, and articulated force that I'll look at another time, using articulated movements, and bringing those into isometric training exercises. So we can talk about what we're doing with those and what they're for a little bit later on, but let's begin with thinking about the exercises themselves. So really basic, I should say, shouldn't I, I've got a whole series on intentional movement where I look at tons and tons of exercises, and I don't want to repeat all that material again. You can integrate that with the learning that you're doing following on with this course, but I do need to introduce some of it. So what I want to do is use where I talk about it on this course, interlink it much more closely with your development as an Yiquan practitioner, interlink it more closely with the idea of fight training. But anyway, we've got to begin at the beginning, so let's begin with just moving forwards and backwards. I'm just trying to find this correct feeling of relaxation and tension, the balance, 50-50. We'll problematize that in a moment. So just forwards and backwards, and really intentionally engaging with the feeling of the movement. And remember, those puzzles that we set to solve, beginning with basic Zhanzhuang posture, those puzzles that we set thinking about coordinating the feelings in the legs, pushing out, pushing in the arms, pushing out, pushing in, now they get extended into movement. We'll think about that idea of extending Zhanzhuang into slow movement in a moment, problematize that as well, some of the things that are said about it. But experientially, as embodied knowledge, if you start to work on solving those puzzles, you've been working on your Zhanzhuang, then at this point you can bring it into this kind of training and feel those exact same things. So you want to be feeling the whole part of your body, and if necessary, also engaging the idea that you can feel the top of your head and the bottom of your feet. So just really make the intention interlink with the whole body. These are things that you've been developing in Zhanzhuang. That's the idea. You can now start bringing them in. So just forward and back like that. I don't have to go through. I don't have to do it for hours, I know. And similarly, so just using these we don't have to just use the hands out like this by any means, but this is how we begin, and then just down, and trying to keep the hands on the same plane. There's very often differences between the hand you're not dominant with. And even like some really famous people, you can see that there's differences between the non-dominant hand. I was watching Yao Cheng Guang the other day doing some movement, and you could see that he's well, I'm assuming that it's his, well, one of the hands was different anyway, so it doesn't really matter, does it, which one was higher or lower? Either could be the dominant hand, but there was definitely a difference, so it happens to everyone. That's socialised conditioning. Your intent is more closely linked to the hand and the side that you've been socialised to be dominant. Said before, I don't believe that to be natural. Change. Just up and down, and just try and keep them on the same plane. So what you don't want to do at first is like bring them back and then out. That's like a second stage. Just try and keep them on the flat like that. And then you can change to out and in like this. This kind of training is really important, and it's easily just as important as your Zhanzhuang practice, and it's easier. There's no excuse for not spending an hour. Well, I'm not going to put a time frame on it. What I always say is like, try and make a third of your training be based around Zhanzhuang and slow movement. That's how I've always done it. A third of my training on a particular day or over a week is Zhanzhuang and slow movement. And the rest is just bog standard fight training, bag work, sparring, strength, fitness. Including weight training. So remember we talked about the idea that certain parts of the body can be, when you go out of structural alignment, that certain parts of the body, certain muscles have to take more force when they hit, strengthening those parts of the body so that they can do that. Zhao Dao's in particular talks about that idea. So we've got in and out, and we've got up and down, and we've got out and in. So we can see you don't have to have like a clever systematization, and the systematization doesn't need to be specifically linked to fight training. It's about movement quality. You bring that into your, hopefully we've already been doing that, just practicing the movements very slow for all your postures. It's exactly the same kind of idea, just stripping it right back now. So from there then we can start thinking about moving on angles, and also we could introduce, for example, the hands either following the same direction or not the same direction. So let's say we're just going to do that way and then down like this. Now some interesting things start coming into play now. So we start integrating our rooting and our feeling of rooting, and this is why, one of the reasons why this is so important. The idea of slow movement, we'll talk about what that's for in a moment, but it's overdetermined, so there's multiple different reasons why we want to do that. But one of the reasons is, like from here, I can feel that I'm now pushing I'm rooting the posture from the front foot to push up like this, and then now I'm pushing from the back leg to push down this way. And this is how you start developing the intuitive ability for how to root the posture, to solidify it so that you can transmit force. Okay, we'll talk about that more. So, and then we can start just training our intention, training our EAT to work on a more advanced level by giving it different problems. Remember, I've talked about Yiquan being like problem solving, it's gamified. And the essential thing to get from that is it's embodied knowledge. So I'll talk about in a bit this idea of glass knowledge that's just kind of superficial knowledge that shatters as soon as it meets reality. We want embodied knowledge, and the way you get that is through training like this. So yes, we can do this, and this helps us. We can feel it as long as we're just training in the right way. We can feel it. You can see the body move as I shift the rooting, and then I shift back. You can see me shifting like that, and this is the kind of, you know, when you see people moving in. You see the old masters moving, that's what they're doing. They're shifting to root the configuration, it's part of what we call stacking the posture. So what's the actual shape of the configuration? How is it going to transmit force to the contact point? How do you stack the configuration? And you can see them playing with that and shifting between the rooting of different movements. And that's quite easy when we do just something like that on an angle. But let's change it now so that the hands go different ways. Like that. Which way is it going to root? And this is when you'll see, like, well, there's two reasons why people do this, and we'll talk about the other one in a minute. One is to get more movement in the posture, to get more power, what we call articulating the movement. But the other reason why people shift like this, you see them shift, is they're shifting their routing. So they're changing which hand is dominant in terms of which one would they be. You know, if I'm gonna push with this hand, like I'm gonna root with that, I'm gonna push forwards like that, so it goes straight back down into the. If I'm gonna push this way, I'm gonna push back that way, just as I would. If I was gonna throw something, I'd just do it like that. You know, I'd push from that back leg, and I'd push from that back leg. It's simple. Disappoint your expectations. The way is not far from the people. All of this stuff is really, really simple. I saw someone lecturing everyone else about how, you know, in Yiquan there's basic concepts, and this is just a basic concept. You know, this on the advanced level it's not like that. No, there's no basic concept, there's no advanced concepts. There's just concepts that are true, and you understand them on different levels, that's all. So this stuff is really, really basic, but it has really profound implications. That's the essence of the Tao at the end of the day. So by changing the handwork, so I'm on two different angles, I can now choose which way I route it from, and which way I'm thinking about how I'm pushing. Am I pushing with the back of this hand out, or am I pushing with the back of that hand? So if I do that, if I do that, emphasize that way, you know that I'm pushing with it. If I do that and emphasize this way, you know that I'm pushing from the back foot. And all we're doing here is we're just training this. We're just training this ability. Well, that's not all we're doing, but I'll come to that in a moment. But we're training this ability. It's all over-determined. You learn one thing, you're learning 10 different things. So what's really interesting about this is we can break it down to one hand, and the same thing still happens. So we can take a leaf out of Tai Chi, and we can do it with one hand, and we can do this kind of Tai Chi posture. And let's say we just do this movement now with one hand. You can see I'm still doing the same thing. I'm still shifting which way I'm routing it. And as I'm doing this, think about this idea that I started talking about right at the start, that there's different ways of doing the same posture, or there's different ways of solving the same problematic. All each one is at the end of the day is the problematic of how do I apply force from any part of my body to a target? What's the configuration? So there's always a problematic as a noun, not as an adjective. It's not problematic movement, it's problematic it's a philosophical concept that we use that means there's a problem to be solved, a problématique in French. And what's the problematic and what's the solution? Those two things always go hand in hand in each one. So that's the problem that we're always solving. What's the configuration to hit a certain point, and how do I develop the intuitive ability to do that? And there's usually different ways of doing that. Usually there's more than two even, but there's always one where we open this way, so we open this way and hit like that kind of posture, open and hit that way. And there's always one where we go with instead of opening, we close. So instead of opening the posture, we close the posture. There's always one where we go like that, where we close the posture. Usually the one where we close the posture, or very, very often, if we have to decide between the two, not always, but there's a general rule that opening tends to use oppositional force much more locally and therefore much more explosively, whereas this still uses oppositional force if we'd use this kind of closing movement rather than opening. Just for a lot of postures, it just seems to be not the solution, but there's plenty of problematics where that is the solution, to use closing. You can look at that. When we've looked at that in multiple different ways, but let's not get into a discussion on it. We can look at some examples another time. What matters is that we have these two options, and that we want to train our intent to fluidly choose which is the right one to develop force. Do I want to open and hit, or do I want to move around with it and hit this way? And you can see, this kind of posture, the closing posture, is much smaller than the opening posture, so it's usually less powerful. It's usually not the solution that we choose if we want a powerful movement. You don't always. Someone could have hold of your arm, and that might be the movement. Close this way, pull in, change, because everything's like it's the context, it's the reality of the context of the fight that very often makes the decision about which is the right one to use. So we can't know that in advance. We can only think about particular problematics, like someone's got my hand here, they're holding it really tight. Do I really want to oppose that force like this with an opening movement, or do I just want to go around it with a closing movement and change, use their strength against them and hit? Classic Tai Chi posture. So when we do this, but first of all, we can just play like push from the back foot, push from the front foot, like that, as our basic training posture. But just like when we did both hands, we can actually use both opening and closing. That's what I'm saying. That's what you're seeing here. When this is opening, this is closing, but I can change which way I'm doing it. And this is what you're seeing in the one of the things that you're seeing when more advanced Yiquan practitioners are doing this kind of movement where the body weight is shifting like this. It's training this, I'm slipping on the floor, it's training this ability to shift between how do I root it, is it opening or closing? How do I root it? And I can go all one way. I said before, and this is what you see when you see like the little stop. That's the lock point. That's the point where you would transmit force. That's what you're training for. For the configuration to just stack into the and set on the root. It's snowing outside, so you can see you can play with both like that, and you can get this kind of way shifting between different parts of the root like that, and you can play with that yourself. It's not like secret knowledge or something, you know, like it's all embodied knowledge. It's all, you get it just through practicing it. And the sooner you can get it, just do it. Don't worry about it. Next we can think about, like, can we do the same thing when we're like pushing forwards or backwards? And so there's quite an interesting thing here in terms of people's movement, and like, there's like a rule, a traditional rule, particularly in Xing Yiquan, that you shouldn't lean too far forward. And also it can get confused with the Zhanzhuang postures where you should, broadly speaking, keep your body upright like that. And that's a good tip, by the way. If you start feeling like pain in your chest when you're doing Zhanzhuang, it can very often be that you've leant a little bit too far forwards, but you can lean forwards to some degree. So again, it's like the rule isn't always completely clear, and it's posture specific. But some rules, when we bring them into the reality of the context of the fight, are clear. So for example, you very often see this kind of movement where people move back like that. And they put all their weight back, and you can say, yeah, there's times when you can, you want to move like that, and it's fine, it's better than being punched in the face, and you just quickly move back like that, and it's fine to train that. The problem is when people start bringing it into push hands and they start doing that and they start moving back like that. It doesn't really take much then. Your axis is so weak. And when they move back, moving back flat like that. And I always recommend, like, some Yiquan people do it. Yiquan does it like Tai Chi, like just drop the weight. I mean, it's like that posture, isn't it? But people very often don't bring that into push hands. They very often move back like that when they're doing stuff. So, like when you're pushed, instead, just loosen the waist like that. Go back down onto close the quad. Go down onto the root. This is down, up, down, open, close. Even if we're just going forwards and backwards in quite a basic way, try not to lean back like that with the posture. Unless you're doing it very deliberately and it's part of an integrated training curriculum where you're also including this kind of where you're going, where you're dropping down like that as well. But the point I wanted to make there was, can you change the way you're rooting? So I can root so that I'm pushing from the back foot, but I can also root so that I'm pushing forwards with my hands and pushing back with my front foot like that. The rule's all about the task in many ways, so there are some exceptions we can talk about, particularly as we go into circular movements, but generally speaking, one of the things to look out for with people who haven't quite got you could do it deliberately, but people who haven't quite got the concept right is their movement is phased wrong. It's what we call phasing, like people who go like that with their movement. But the rule it's not quite that clear because it's got to be phased. So one, as you start getting here, pushing forwards, then you start pulling back and the hands are going forward a little bit. And even as you start moving forward, the hands are still pulling back like that. And you're getting this kind of, and you can see what it's for. It's for this kind of, it's what we call the articulation of force, like this little bit here that articulates the force. I'll talk about that more in a moment. So the movement needs to be phased. It doesn't need to be, it shouldn't strictly be like robotically like that, or indeed robotically like. And even if you have a lock point, it shouldn't be robotic like that. It should be phased just ever so slightly. And I suppose the person who takes the phase up to the maximum that you could possibly get it is Yao Zhongzun. If you look at his movement, his phase is like, it's quite a big phase, so that like when he's here, he just starts moving back a little bit and then moving forwards. And the reason he does that, as we'll see in a moment, is it's about maximising power, or training to maximise power. For now, all we need to think about is just advancing our movement a little bit to get this phased. See, my hands are still coming back, but my body's moving forwards. And don't worry about the other stuff I'm doing with my body. I'll do it just completely flat with my body. See, my body doesn't want to do that. I'll talk about why that is in a moment. So it starts getting a little bit robotic if you keep your body completely flat. But you want to try and get that phased movement, and the way to do that is to play with it. The classic mistake everyone makes straight away is thinking it's like this, out and out. And you think, oh, that's oppositional force, like that. I'll just go out like that, and that's opening. No, it's not. It's not, it's just incorrect movement. There's times when you would do a posture like that. It's like the don't kiss me posture. So there's definitely times when you're going to do a posture like that. That's not the point. For the basic training, we want this phased movement, and there's very particular reasons why we want that, and we'll come back to that in a moment. So next we can change into out this way, again, that we looked at as the basic posture. Now look, I'm doing the same thing. I'm setting the rooting. Now I can feel that in my, the soles of my feet, that the posture is setting one way or the other with the root like that. I can feel it in my heels, and then the front part of the foot just stabilising the posture. So here I'm imagining I'm bracing it against the posture here, and this again comes back to this idea there's no kinetic chain between this hand and this foot. There's whole body structure, but whole body structure isn't one thing. It changes according to the way the configuration is stacked, and this is stacked differently. So say a punch like that, where like a Xing Yiquan punch where it's all stacked in line. This is stacked, this is all open, and this is very much relying on strength. Yeah, okay, there's a certain amount of maximisation of strength through using consistency, like the whole body consistency that I'm trying to develop here, through finding this balance between relaxation and tension and linking everything together into the posture. There's a certain amount of that, but nevertheless this muscle group is taking a lot of this muscle group and this muscle group here, they're taking a lot of the strain here. They're doing the heavy lifting, or the heavy pushing, literally. So, or this, you know, more on the back here, obviously, like that. So that tells you, just like Zhao Daoxin says, you've got to identify these weak points in configurational construction. When you stack a configuration in a certain way, like where are the weak points, and that tells you where you've got to strengthen, i.e. do weight training to strengthen those areas. Come back to that in a moment, of why you should do that, whatever anyone says. So here in my mind, I'm emphasizing the right, and here I'm emphasizing the left. So I'm imagining, like, I'm bracing it against I'm pushing against, just like you would. So when I push out this way, I'm pushing out with my front foot, and then when I change this way, what I'm doing is I'm squeezing in with my back leg is squeezing in that way to brace this posture. So now I'm emphasizing the left hand because I'm going this way, closing, emphasizing the left. Now I'm emphasizing the right, pushing out with my front leg. Now I'm emphasizing, I can feel it, I can feel the muscle group there working to brace against this opening and closing posture. And we start training those micro movements and micro adjustments of configurational adjustment, and we start seeing that a configuration can be moving, and I suppose that's the next thing to start thinking about. Okay, so I want to stick with sharp edit to brew lovely Chinese tea. It's too hot. I want to stick with isometric linear movements for now, because articulated movements and screw-in force movements, circular movements, they all kind of deserve a discussion in their own right. So we can move on and think about, like, well, what actually are we doing here? What's the point of this training? So there's a few things going on. So there's all of that, and you can go away and practice all of that stuff for yourself. Like, it's experiential knowledge. If you're engaged with it, yeah, okay, someone just checking your posture and just correcting mistakes can save you time. But there's no reason why you can't just develop just through practicing that movement on your own and just experiencing it and developing intuitively. But it's overdetermined, so there's multiple different things going on. And one really important thing to think about is that it's not necessarily about application. So we'll start by saying one of the things that it is about, and that's the development of the interconnection of your intents in your body. And that doesn't necessarily need any kind of visualization or anything like that. You don't need any visualization when you're doing that kind of movement. Visualization helps. It can intensify that feeling. Why that's important is we've got certain people who are arguing, like Yiquan instructors, who are saying things like intent or will, you know, maybe better translated as will in many cases, is just imagination. It just is the visualization. It's nothing to do with actual anything else that's going on with the posture. That's wrong. Those people are wrong, and it's very, very misleading, and it's not a coincidence that those people have nothing to show in practical terms where this has led them to. So this is what we call glass theory. So imagine a piece of glass and it's got loads of stuff written on it. All the right keywords are there written on the piece of glass. Then you go and have a look at it, you knock on it, and it's but for them it's like, you know, forever being window lickers stuck at the like the person in front of the shop window looking at the Rolexes. You know, you're forever. Maybe it's not the best example. It's not imagination. Intent, will is not imagination. And we can think about this straight away. Remember, I talked about the idea that it's very hard to visualize. It's very hard to visualize walking. So you can lie in your bed and you can imagine, and I mean not walking, but what it feels like to walk. You can feel like what it feels like on your feet. Maybe if you chafe, maybe you get a bit of a bad back, you can kind of visualize that. But the overall bodily feeling of walking is very hard to visualize as a sensation, as opposed to once we start moving with this kind of movement, it's very, very easy to visualize. And all these basic movements, you can just lie in your bed without doing them and just visualize the movement themselves. And you can feel an embodied feeling like you are doing these movements. That is because your intention has flooded into your body and connected to it in a way that makes it more real. It's part of the ideological repression through postural repression of society that for most of the time our connection to our own bodies is dead, and it's part of a revolution of Yiquan that it's like a physiological revolution that we start reclaiming that territory and our sensation to it, so we can really visualize what it feels like to start moving like this. I know the camera can't always pick that up, but that I vibrate when I move like that. I know. Actually, I can do it more than ever now. It's getting like a much stronger ability, so I might be able to pick it up a little bit better. It's something people always comment on when they see me moving in person. I'll come back and talk about that in a moment because it's not quite the same thing in any case. But we can visualise that. We can visualise that really strongly because our intent is so interconnected with our body. That's nothing to do with imagination. Thinking that intent is just imagination is just confusing the method with the achievement, and that's what we call glass theory. So it's not embodied because people haven't taken it to the point where it's practical, useful theory. It's not embodied theory, it's glass theory. It just shatters. But critically, the keywords are very often correct, and that can be a real problem when people start talking about. We've got a situation with people like, I just saw it the other day, like, phrase it very carefully, but it's like gaslighting. So people there's no evidence whatsoever that they can use Yiquan in any kind of practical way, talking about other people who are all theory. So people who are all theory and have got loads and loads of videos out talking about theory, gaslighting us that other people are all theory. And this is very often based around this idea of, woo, like people who've got kind of magic powers, and people getting very upset about that. And I've been there myself, and it doesn't make any difference. There's a saying in the academic world that the academic world is so vicious because the stakes are so low. And I think that's just it, isn't it? That's just Yiquan as it stands at the moment. So you've got people like, I won't name any names, but they do this and someone flies away, and actually that's not limited to, there's some very famous Yiquan people who at the same time as criticising that stuff then do demonstrations like that, which is also very problematic. And in some cases they're people who've got real skill, but nevertheless do those kind of fake demos. So that's a whole other issue. You've got people who getting irate about these kind of magic power people, and they're getting irate because the stakes are so low. The stakes are so low. It's like, if I can just, like you got someone on, you got like a chi master doing this stuff, and you got other people saying, I want to come around and fight you, or other people saying, like, I'd like to meet you and put you in your place. This almost kind of like crypto-fascist, desire to physically punish, and it's because the stakes are so low. It's because it doesn't matter at all. It's like they want to be king of what's left. But what's left? What is left? What is left? Nothing. Like, so you defeat those people. What's left? Nothing. You're the king of nothing. So, no, I want to be the king of this realm where all we ever do all the time is just talk about theory and wave our arms about, like none of these people pretty much can put the gloves on and demonstrate the actual Yiquan theory in practice, in live training. They just can't do it. So that's what they'll be king of once they've defeated the people who've got magic powers. So it's all gaslighting, and it's all indicates glass theory. I've I could go on a big thing about that, but I'm not going to, but there's a lot of gaslighting around it, the idea of elastic force. So we have this thing where people say, you see a demo, someone does that and someone flies back, and sometimes it's even like Wang Shengzhai's own students are doing demos like this. Sometimes it's really famous people who should know better, not naming any names, who are letting their students fly back. It kind of happens to everyone. It happens to me. Like I've had it with my senior student where he's like, we're doing push hands and I'm doing something and he's like, well, I know I didn't use that much force. What's he doing flying over there? I said, what are you doing? He said, well, I don't want to get pushed over. I said, don't do that. Don't do that. It's ridiculous. Like, and I've had to tell him. So that's what you've got to do. You know, as an instructor, you've got to tell the students, don't do that. But the problem is a narrative is being built where it's saying like, well, there's this thing called elastic force, and when you do that, then people fly back, and that's just like a basic skill. It doesn't indicate, like I saw someone saying, look, it doesn't indicate whether you can fight or not. It's like, well, hold on a minute, it's just not real. It's not whether you can fight with it or not. That's not real. You go like that and you're an old dude and you go like that and someone goes flying back. And I know I can't convince people who believe in that because they want to believe in it. So I'm never getting around that. And I'm never getting around these people who are like, the stakes are so low people. I'm never getting around that. All we can do is just replace it. Regardless, what that opens up the discussion of is like, well, what is this elastic force thing that we're talking about? And the danger always, like I always say, the danger is in thinking that something's just one thing, and it's not. We're talking about a complex range of things that can be covered by a simple term. And it's something Yang Demo talks about, that it's very problematic in Yiquan that we use these shorthand terms. But what I want people to think about is when we say, like, we want to find the combination between relaxation and tension, we want to find, and that's literally the Mandarin word for elastic is made out of the word for tension and the word for relax. Like, actually, even an elastic band isn't the same tension. You know, it's a different tension depending on how far you stretch it and so on. When we say we're trying to find a balance, like the doctrine of the mean, which also is a complex term, it's something Wang Shengzhai uses all the time, very much to make us understand that we have to make compromises. You know, for example, a compromise between issuing force and not getting sparked out before we can actually hit. So the compromise we make with the reality of the fight is very often the most important compromise. So we're trying to find this doctrine of the mean between relaxation and tension. And now what people think is like, if you find that, so that you get it like it's exactly 50-50, that you'll hit some point of magical ability, that then you'll have this magic power and you'll be able to do that. And then they start talking about, oh, that's just elastic force. It's like, let's just stop and think about that for a minute, because that's just bonkers. It's just numerology. So think about it. What you're saying is like it's glass theory, so it's not embodied knowledge. And when it's glass theory, you can start writing it out as like an equation and saying, well, we want 50% tension and 50% relaxation. And here's the middle bit of the Venn diagram where magic powers exist, right? It's like the kind of thing that like 17th century mystics were doing, or Pythagoras, where you think like if you do mathematics, you'll find some magical layer of the universe where magic powers exist. It's like thinking like that. It's literally numerology, because it all exists in the theory. Like 50%, somewhere between exactly 50% of this and 50% of that, there's this magic. So let's think about it like this. You're teaching someone to drive, and as a learning device, you say, look, imagine there's a line down the middle of the road, stick to that line. Now, you know that when you say that you don't mean in all circumstances, if you stick to that line, you'll be a great driver and you'll do everything right. You know you've got to go around a horse sometimes, or a cyclist, and you know that when you're overtaking or you're going around a corner or avoiding obstacles, there's ways of moving on and off that line. And it's actually only by doing that you become a good driver. It's just a learning device. This is just a learning device as well, to capture that 50-50 feeling. And it's never going to be exactly 50-50 anyway. It's just a learning device, and nothing is going to happen magically when you do that. The most important thing that this is doing is integrate, by bringing a little bit more tension into your body. It's integrating your your intent more with your body. Exactly with this, you bring in a little bit of tension into the body so that your intent can actually feel something. It's making you feel your body. It's bringing intent into your body, literally. You can do it with pain. You can do it with sex. You can do it with being tickled. You can do it, an insect can do it by biting you. There's all kinds of things, or just walking on you. There's all kinds of things that can do that. The wind can do it. But we're using this particular method of embodying our intent. Yeah, this isn't rocket science. It's really, really obvious stuff. And what happens then is that, it's not quite that simple, because there's a couple of other things that we want to do. One is we want to transmit force. So we've talked about the idea that when you come to the hit point, this brew's going to go. I'm going to use screwing force and pop this brew over me. When you use screwing force, when you use your configuration and you stack it up to the hit point, at that moment when you hit, you tense the whole body for a split second. It's what Xiao Daoxin calls it the lock point. We usually just break that apart to say, if you do it on the air, it's the lock point, and then when you hit something, it's the hit point. When you do it to the hit point, you do it with full intensity and you tense the body. Not completely, but much more than when, for example, 50-50. You change the ratio between tension and relaxation so that it's 75-80% tense, and because that transmits power to the target. The solidity of the structure transmits power to the target, and that extra last tiny little bit of flexibility just stops the structure being brittle. And lots of things can happen if the structure is too brittle. If you're too tense, you can injure yourself, or the power can just be transferred back into you. There's no absorption. If you hit something that's a lot harder or someone that's a lot harder than you expect, there's got to be some give in that, some relaxation in there, some springiness. That changes the ratio between relaxation and tension, so that can't be. It's not 50-50. But what confuses people, I think, very often is push hands. So there's whole debate to be had around push hands. But what happens with push hands is people try and maintain this 50-50 consistency while they're doing push hands, and that makes you think that this is the ideal form of strength. Again, it's this kind of numerology thing where you think there's a special zone of strength where it's flexible and springy, but it's just tense enough, it's just using just enough muscle use, and somehow, because it's quite relaxed, there'll be a springiness that's so intense throughout the body that you just go like that and someone will spring back. That's bonkers. That's bonkers if you believe that. But, to all those people who are obsessed with the people who believe that, that's low stakes, man. Who cares? Who cares? What I care about is, how does this stuff relate to MMA? Right, just let's put it on a bottom line like that. How does each one relate to MMA? I couldn't give a damn about these. They're just, who cares, So when people do push hands, what happens is the other person very often also is maintaining this 50-50 consistency, so that it feels like this is the perfect zone of muscular strength and springiness to use. You can do all your, I'm not a slouch when it comes to push hands, that's the bottom line, and I'm not criticising it in that sense, but I'm saying this illusion is carried over, and this is what you see particularly in Yao's Yiquan, with a ridiculous overemphasis on push hands as opposed to actual fight training. And the way that the push hands is done is so divorced from the reality of actual fights, So what we can say is you think that you found this magic zone of the right amount of strength just because your opponent is doing that as well, and that makes it quite easier to do all these postures that you see. And of course, if the other person is stiffer, in many ways it's easier to do a lot of those postures. But if they're stiff but not stiff, if they're really strong, let's say, it's also the other thing with push hands, isn't it? It's so divorced from what we now know as grappling, stand-up grappling, where people are grabbing you, they're underhooking you and grabbing you around the head. Get a catch wrestler, go and do some push hands with a catch wrestler and then see what happens, because I've done this, catch wrestler and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. See what happens, right? It's a totally different paradigm. And also judo, elite judo as well, also. So you get a catch wrestler to grab you around the head and all of a sudden you start trying to make this push hand stuff work and it doesn't. And you start realising how important strength is. There's other parameters to it, like you can go round sometimes when people have grabbed you, you can use this kind of elastic kind of movement to go round people. If they're very strong and they won't move, you can get a lot of movement in your own movement. Like they don't have to move their arms that much for you to go around something like a Young Chun movement. So there's things like that. But if you think this kind of elastic force will work against some really serious wrestler who's got you in a headlock or has got you like this, it's like reality check. And even if you can really issue force, you know, very often what we're missing is that when we issue force and use Farley, that's just to create a tiny little opening that we've then got to maximise, like hit and hit again. Once we get that opening, hit again with something else like that. It's not going to be like you're going to do that and they're going to go flying off like that. It's just ridiculous. The only people who believe that, it's like Zhao Daoxin says, people are attracted to this stuff because they're afraid. People are attracted to martial arts because they're afraid. And some people who are very afraid really start believing in like empowering themselves with magic. That's the bottom line. So okay, that's really a lot. So work on those skills. Think about the things that I've said. Keep working on your standing. Think about the exercises. I'm going to do a follow-up video now where I show you exercises to go along with the theory. So thanks very much for watching. See you in the next one. One love.